You probably clicked on this thumbnail without thinking too much about it. Maybe the title caught your attention, or the image looked interesting. But pause for a second and ask yourself, was that really you who made the choice to watch this video? Or did something unknown make the decision for you? Your brain, your habits, your past experiences, maybe even the algorithm itself? Unless you misclicked, there's no definitive way to prove that watching this video was truly your choice, and even then, your decision may not be entirely your own. Yes, there was a moment of apparent decision. A finger moved, a screen lit up, but behind that simple act lies a chain of causes you did not choose. Your sense of interest, the feeling that something was worth clicking, was not summoned by you. It arose unbidden. Something about this content aligned with the structure of your mind as it currently exists, shaped by genetics, social conditions, personal history, and the design of machines you did not invent. You can tell yourself that you like certain things, that you're curious or amused, but these mental states, though deeply personal, are not freely chosen either. You did not author your childhood. You did not select your emotional reactions. You did not pick the neural pathways that define your aesthetic sensibility. These things were built over time by experiences that, themselves, were not freely selected. We believe ourselves to be authors of our actions because our choices feel voluntary. But this feeling, this subjective impression of choice, is itself a product of events you did not cause. Even your curiosity, the drive that seems so intimately yours, is the product of a complex interplay of environment and biology. You find this topic interesting because something in your past taught you to find it interesting, and that was not your doing. If you trace the path of causality far enough, your preferences, values, and choices dissolve into the fabric of the universe, shaped by forces as impersonal as gravity and time. Like the YouTube algorithm, that quiet, invisible hand guiding your digital world, it learns what you watch and feeds you more of it. And you think you are choosing, but are you? Or are you walking a path that was paved for you, one step at a time, by clicks you made days or months ago? Free will, in simple terms, is the idea that we can make our own choices, that we are not just puppets controlled by strings we cannot see. It is the belief that we decide what to do and how to live. But what if that belief is an illusion? This question matters more than it might seem at first. It touches everything: how we judge right and wrong, how we create laws, how we build religions, and even how we find meaning in our personal lives. If we are not truly free, then do we deserve praise for our successes or blame for our failures? If our choices are not fully ours, what does that say about justice, morality, or even love? This exact concept of free will, whether we genuinely choose our actions or are simply following a script written by biology, upbringing, and circumstance, has been a subject of intense debate for thousands of years. Philosophers from ancient Greece to modern universities have wrestled with it. Theologians have tied it to the soul. Scientists now prove it through brain scans, and ethicists question what it means for justice and responsibility. In this video, we'll be exploring this very concept in depth. When we begin tracing the question of free will to its origins, we must first acknowledge that the very earliest roots of this question lie beyond our direct reach. The ideas and reflections of those who lived before recorded history remain forever hidden. It is only from the time of Socrates that we gain our first clear glimpses into how human beings consciously began to ask themselves whether they are truly the masters of their choices. Thus, while Socrates himself is not the center of this inquiry, the period he lived in represents the true beginning of the recorded journey of this profound question. In the bustling and often chaotic life of ancient Athens, a new spirit of inquiry started to grow. Human beings, for perhaps the first time in a systematic and public way, began to wonder, are our actions truly our own? Are we free to choose? Or are our lives shaped entirely by forces beyond our control, whether the will of the gods, the pull of destiny, or the unbreakable customs of society? It was in this climate that the seeds of the idea of free will were first planted. One of the earliest and clearest signs of this emerging idea comes from the method of questioning that was practiced and recorded in the Socratic dialogues. These dialogues show human beings wrestling openly with their own beliefs, searching for truth, not by accepting external authority, but by examining their own minds. This act of questioning itself hints at an important possibility, that people are capable of examining, challenging, and ultimately choosing their own values. The notion of free will, in its earliest fragile form, arises not from any declaration, but from the simple yet revolutionary possibility that reflection could lead to genuine choice rather than blind obedience. As thought deepened over time, the idea that human beings might possess some degree of freedom found stronger expression. Plato, writing in the generations after Socrates, offered the view that the soul, the deepest and most essential part of a person, has the ability to choose its own path. In his vision, freedom was not simply a matter of making everyday decisions. It was the soul's eternal struggle to remember and align itself with the eternal truths beyond the distractions of the material world. Yet, Plato also wove into his philosophy the threads of fate and cosmic necessity, recognizing that while souls have the power to choose, they are not untouched by the wider order of the universe. Thus, the concept of free will, even in its early philosophical blossoming, carried within it a subtle tension between freedom and destiny. Following this line of thought, Aristotle brought a more practical and earthly lens to the problem. He carefully distinguished between voluntary and involuntary actions, introducing the idea that responsibility and freedom are tied to our ability to act with knowledge and intention. His observations suggested that freedom does not require absolute independence from the world, but rather an internal capacity to deliberate and choose within the circumstances one inhabits. Here, the idea of free will matured into a question not of escaping causality altogether, but of whether and how human beings could be meaningfully responsible for their own actions. Throughout this early period, thinkers were not merely speculating in the abstract. Their reflections were embedded in the cultural and religious traditions of their time, many of which held a deep belief in fate. The Greeks spoke often of Moira, the inescapable fate allotted to every being, suggesting that much of life might be predetermined. Yet, even within these traditions, the human desire to affirm choice and responsibility never fully disappeared. The very act of raising the question of free will, even against a backdrop of fatalism, showed that humans longed to believe that their lives were more than the unfolding of a script written by unseen hands. Thus, the birth of the question of free will was not the result of any single thinker or doctrine, but rather the awakening of an idea within the human spirit, the daring thought that amidst the forces of nature, tradition, and destiny, there might be a space, however small or fragile, for genuine choice. It was an idea still in its infancy, tender and uncertain, but one that would grow to shape every future exploration of human nature, morality, and meaning. As the question of free will continued to evolve, it moved beyond the philosophical streets of ancient Greece and into the heart of religion, where it took on an even more profound and complex meaning. Religion, by its very nature, seeks to answer some of the deepest questions about human life, morality, and destiny, and it was inevitable that the problem of free will would find a central place in its teachings. However, religions faced a difficult challenge. On the one hand, they wanted to preserve the idea that human beings are morally responsible for their actions. On the other hand, they also affirmed that a divine power governs the universe, often in ways that seem all-encompassing and absolute. Balancing human freedom with divine control became one of the great struggles of religious thought, a struggle that continues even today. In Christianity, the conversation about free will reached a particularly important and lasting form with St. Augustine, a major thinker of the 4th and 5th centuries. Augustine believed passionately that human beings do possess free will. He argued that without free will, there could be no real meaning to sin, virtue, or salvation. For how could one be judged for actions that were not freely chosen? Yet Augustine also saw that human beings, after the original sin of Adam and Eve, are deeply wounded in their ability to choose what is good. According to him, free will still exists, but it is weakened and distorted by sin. Humans often choose selfishness and evil not because they are forced to, but because their inner nature has become misaligned with divine goodness. Augustine's vision, recorded in works like Confessions and On Free Choice of the Will, deeply shaped Christian theology by asserting that grace from God is necessary to heal the will and guide it back toward good choices. Thus, even while affirming free will, Augustine placed it within a framework where divine assistance is essential. Later in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas sought to refine and balance the question even further. Aquinas, drawing on the rediscovered writings of Aristotle and blending them with Christian doctrine, proposed that God's knowledge and power do not cancel human freedom. In his masterpiece, the Summa Theologica, Aquinas argued that while God knows every choice we will make and even moves all things toward their ultimate purpose, he does so in a way that respects the genuine freedom of human beings. For Aquinas, God's providence and human free will operate on different levels. God, existing outside of time, sees all events in their completeness, while human beings experience life moment by moment, genuinely making choices. In this view, divine control and human freedom are not enemies, but two sides of the same mystery. Aquinas thus offered a more optimistic and structured attempt to explain how freedom and destiny could coexist without contradiction. Islamic thought also engaged deeply with the problem of free will, and in some ways, the debates were even sharper. Early Muslim theologians were divided into two main schools of thought. The Qadariyya emphasized human free will, arguing that people must be free in order to be justly rewarded or punished by God. According to this view, moral responsibility requires that actions are truly chosen. In contrast, the Jabariyya argued for a strong form of predestination, maintaining that all actions are determined by God's will and that human beings have no real power to act otherwise. These debates were not merely abstract, but shaped important theological and political discussions within early Islamic societies, influencing ideas about law, justice, and personal responsibility. Over time, Islamic scholars developed more nuanced positions, such as the Asharite school, which proposed that while God creates all actions, humans acquire responsibility through their intentions, a compromise that tried to respect both divine omnipotence and human moral accountability. In Eastern traditions, particularly Hinduism and Buddhism, the conversation about free will took a different form, but remained deeply significant. In Hindu philosophy, the concept of karma is central. Karma teaches that actions have consequences, shaping future experiences across cycles of rebirth. On one hand, this framework suggests that individuals are free to act and are responsible for their actions. On the other hand, the idea of samsara, or the endless cycle of death and rebirth, implies that many aspects of life are shaped by past deeds, creating a complex web of cause and effect that can seem overwhelmingly deterministic. Similarly, in Buddhism, while personal effort and ethical choices are crucial for achieving enlightenment, the belief in dependent origination means that every event arises from countless interconnected causes. Thus, freedom exists, but it is limited and conditioned. And liberation comes not so much from exerting absolute free will as from deeply understanding the nature of existence and letting go of attachments. Throughout these religious traditions, a pattern emerges. Almost universally, religion seeks to honor both the importance of human choice and the grandeur of divine or cosmic control. Pure, unrestricted free will, as philosophers might imagine it, rarely appears. Instead, freedom is seen as real, but always somehow shaped, helped, or hindered by forces larger than the individual. Divine grace, destiny, karma, and cosmic law serve to remind humanity that while we may choose, we do so within a world that we did not create and that we do not fully command. This delicate balance between freedom and control gives religious discussions of free will a deep and poignant character, reflecting humanity's longing to believe in both personal responsibility and a meaningful, ordered universe. As the flow of history moved from the ancient world into the Middle Ages, and eventually into the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, the question of free will became even more tangled and profound. During the early Middle Ages, much of European thought was shaped by religious traditions, especially Christianity, which had already inherited and blended earlier ideas about human freedom and divine control. However, as scholars and thinkers began to explore the natural world more carefully, a new idea slowly started to take shape, one that would pose a major challenge to the belief in free will. This idea was determinism, the belief that every event, every action, and every thought has a cause that explains it fully. In a deterministic world, nothing happens by true choice. Instead, everything unfolds according to fixed laws, like a chain where each link follows the one before it. This raised an uncomfortable but important question. If everything we do is the result of prior causes, from the movements of the stars to the chemistry of our brains, then are we truly free? Or are we simply acting out a script written long before we were born? The Renaissance, spanning roughly from the 14th to the 17th centuries, brought a wave of new energy to this discussion, even as the shadow of determinism began to grow. The Renaissance was a period of rediscovery and rebirth, where ancient texts were studied anew, scientific curiosity blossomed, and the arts flourished. Central to Renaissance thinking was humanism, a movement that emphasized human potential, dignity, and the capacity for self-determination. Humanists celebrated the power of reason, creativity, and moral choice, arguing that individuals could shape their own destinies. Figures such as Erasmus and Pico della Mirandola spoke eloquently about the greatness and freedom of the human spirit. In this spirit, the Renaissance offered a hopeful vision that despite the forces of fate and nature, human beings possess the extraordinary gift of choosing their own paths, of striving toward virtue and truth through the exercise of reason and will. Yet, even as humanism spread, the foundations of a more mechanistic view of the world were quietly being laid by advances in mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy. This tension came fully into the open during the Enlightenment, the great intellectual movement of the 17th and 18th centuries. The Enlightenment was characterized by an intense faith in reason, science, and progress. Thinkers like Galileo, Newton, and Descartes helped develop a vision of the universe governed by clear, discoverable laws. Out of this grew what later came to be called the clockwork universe theory, the idea that the universe operates like a giant, precise machine, set in motion by God or natural forces, with every part following fixed rules. In such a universe, the notion of true free will seemed to shrink, as human beings were seen increasingly as part of the machine, their actions determined by the same forces that govern the planets and the tides. Philosophers began to wrestle deeply with the implications of this vision. Among the most influential thinkers of this period was John Locke, who offered a subtle and important view of human freedom. Locke distinguished between the freedom to act and the freedom to will. He argued that while we might be free to act according to our desires, we are not free to choose those desires themselves. In other words, we can pursue the goals that arise within us, but we do not have ultimate control over what goals and motivations appear in our minds. This opened up a new and complex view of freedom, one that acknowledged human agency while also recognizing the deep influence of internal and external causes. Another major figure, David Hume, brought an even more skeptical and psychological perspective to the debate. Hume suggested that free will might not be an objective reality, but rather a feeling or impression that arises when we act without visible constraint. He argued that when our actions flow smoothly from our desires without obvious external compulsion, we experience the sensation of being free. Yet for Hume, this feeling does not necessarily mean that we are truly free in a deeper metaphysical sense. Everything we do, he believed, still follows from prior causes, just as water flows downhill according to natural laws. Hume's contribution was to emphasize that much of what we think of as freedom might be more about perception than about any underlying truth. Thus, from the Middle Ages through the Enlightenment, the idea of free will underwent a dramatic evolution. It moved from being primarily a religious concern to becoming a central philosophical and scientific puzzle. As new knowledge about the natural world grew, so too did doubts about the traditional view of human freedom. Determinism rose as a powerful and troubling idea, suggesting that perhaps every choice is just a link in a long, unbreakable chain of causes. At the same time, the Renaissance and Enlightenment thinkers refused to abandon entirely the belief in human dignity and agency, seeking new ways to defend the importance of choice, even within a world increasingly understood as governed by fixed laws. This rising conflict set the stage for the even more intense battles of thought that would follow in the modern age, where free will would be tested not just by philosophy, but by science itself. As human knowledge expanded further into the modern age, the rise of scientific determinism brought a new and formidable challenge to the idea of free will. In the 17th century, Isaac Newton revolutionized the way people understood the universe. Through his groundbreaking work in mathematics and physics, Newton revealed that the world operates according to precise, discoverable laws. Gravity, motion, and force could all be explained through simple but powerful rules. For the first time, it seemed that the universe was not a chaotic or mysterious place, but rather a vast and orderly machine, running like clockwork according to fixed principles. This view, known as Newtonian mechanics, painted a picture of a world where every object's behavior, from the falling of an apple to the orbit of a planet, could be predicted exactly if one knew the right information. It was a breathtaking achievement, filling people with a new sense of wonder about human reason and the power of science. But it also quietly tightened the grip of determinism. If the universe was predictable and law-driven, it seemed increasingly difficult to imagine how human beings could be truly free. Every thought, every action might simply be the inevitable result of earlier causes, just as surely as a ball rolling down a hill follows the slope laid out before it. This vision of a completely determined universe reached its most vivid expression in the early 19th century with the work of Pierre-Simon Laplace. In 1814, Laplace proposed a thought experiment that has since become famous in philosophical discussions. He imagined an intelligence so vast and powerful that it could know the position and movement of every particle in the universe at a single moment. If such a being existed, Laplace argued, it could predict every future event and retrodict every past event with perfect accuracy. This idea, often referred to as Laplace's demon, suggested that mystery, chance, and true choice were illusions. In a universe entirely ruled by causality, free will would have no room to exist, because every action, even the smallest decision, would be nothing more than the inevitable consequence of prior events. Laplace's vision did not merely imply that human beings are influenced by their surroundings or their biology. It claimed that every thought and feeling is already determined by the vast chain of cause and effect stretching back to the beginning of time. For a time, this mechanical, deterministic view of the universe seemed almost unshakable. It provided powerful explanations for phenomena that had once seemed magical or incomprehensible. It also encouraged a sense of intellectual humility, for it showed that human understanding must fit within the larger structure of natural law. Yet, as the 20th century dawned, cracks began to appear in this grand clockwork vision. The development of quantum mechanics, a revolutionary new branch of physics, revealed that at the tiniest levels of reality, the behavior of particles is not entirely predictable. Electrons, photons, and other fundamental particles do not follow clear deterministic paths. Instead, they behave in ways that seem governed by probabilities rather than certainties. Events at the quantum level cannot be forecast with perfect precision. We can only speak about the likelihood of different outcomes. However, it is important to approach this carefully, for quantum mechanics does not simply overthrow determinism in favor of complete randomness. Rather, it introduces a new kind of indeterminacy. In the world of large objects, including human brains and bodies, the laws of classical physics still hold remarkably well. The unpredictable behavior of tiny particles does not necessarily mean that human choices are random or free in any traditional sense. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that at a fundamental level, the universe is not fully determined, but others propose ways to maintain determinism even within quantum theory. Scientists and philosophers continue to debate these questions, and there is no absolute agreement. What quantum mechanics has clearly shown, however, is that the universe is more complex, mysterious, and dynamic than the strict mechanical view of Newton and Laplace had imagined. The neat, clock-like certainty of earlier centuries gave way to a picture of reality filled with probabilities, uncertainties, and strange forms of connection that challenge our common sense. Thus, the rise of scientific determinism first narrowed the space for free will almost to the point of disappearance, making human freedom seem like a mere illusion within an unbreakable chain of causes. Yet, the discoveries of modern physics also reopened that space, not by proving free will exists, but by showing that the universe may not be as rigid and predetermined as once believed. This tension between predictability and unpredictability, between causality and chance, continues to shape the way we think about freedom today, leaving us to wonder whether human beings are machines, miracles, or something else entirely, something still not fully understood even by the best minds of science and philosophy. Then, the scientific study of the human mind began to take shape in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Psychology offered a new lens through which to examine the question of free will. While earlier thinkers had debated whether humans were free in relation to the cosmos, divine will, or natural laws, psychology turned the focus inward and asked whether people are free even within their own minds. This shift brought a fresh and often unsettling perspective. The human self, once imagined as a rational agent choosing freely among options, was now reimagined as a complex, layered system shaped by hidden forces, many of which operate beneath conscious awareness. One of the earliest and most influential figures in this transformation was Sigmund Freud. Freud proposed that the mind is divided into conscious and unconscious parts, and he believed that much of our behavior is governed not by deliberate choices, but by unconscious desires, fears, and conflicts. These unconscious forces, shaped largely in childhood and hidden from direct view, push and pull us in ways we rarely notice. According to Freud, even seemingly rational actions are often disguises for deeper, unresolved emotional patterns. For example, a person who chooses a career in law might unconsciously be seeking their parents' approval or trying to resolve an old sense of guilt. In this view, free will becomes an illusion because the true causes of behavior lie outside our conscious control. We feel like we are choosing freely, but in reality our minds are navigating ancient inner storms, responding to symbols and memories we do not fully understand. Building on but also reacting against Freud, later psychologists like B.F. Skinner took this idea in a different and more radical direction. Skinner, working in the mid-20th century, argued that human behavior could be explained entirely by observable stimuli and responses, without needing to refer to any inner life at all. He developed the theory of behaviorism, which sees all behavior as a product of conditioning. According to Skinner, we do not act because we decide to act in some abstract or mystical sense. Instead, we behave in ways that have been shaped by patterns of reward and punishment over time. If a child receives praise for speaking politely, they are more likely to repeat that behavior. If a person is punished for speaking out, they may learn to remain silent. Skinner believed that by carefully analyzing the environment and the consequences of actions, we could predict and even control behavior. In his famous experiments using what came to be known as Skinner boxes, he placed rats and pigeons in enclosed chambers and trained them to press levers or peck at buttons in exchange for food rewards. Over time, the animals learned to repeat the behaviors that brought rewards and avoid those that did not. These experiments showed that even complex actions could be built up from simple reinforcements, challenging the idea that there was any need to appeal to internal freedom or willpower. What made Skinner's conclusion so provocative was not simply that they applied to animals, but that he believed they applied just as much to people. He argued that all human behavior, from everyday habits to moral choices, could be seen as the result of environmental conditioning. From this perspective, the experience of choosing freely is not a sign of actual freedom, but a side effect of the brain processing learned associations. We might believe we are choosing a partner or a career based on our own preferences, but Skinner would suggest those preferences have themselves been shaped by earlier rewards, punishments, and social influences. In this framework, free will is not a real force in the world, but a kind of comforting illusion, a story we tell ourselves to make sense of decisions that were actually formed by forces outside our control. Both Freud's focus on the unconscious and Skinner's emphasis on environmental conditioning contributed to a broader idea that has deeply influenced modern thought. The idea that while we may feel free, our actions are often the result of causes we neither see nor understand. This insight does not necessarily destroy the concept of freedom, but it does invite us to rethink what freedom means. Perhaps being free does not require total independence from all influences, but rather awareness of those influences and the ability to work with or against them. Psychology, then, does not close the door on free will, but reframes it as a delicate and partial thing, always under pressure from forces both inside and outside the self. It asks us to consider whether true freedom lies not in escaping these forces entirely, but in learning to see and navigate them with as much honesty and understanding as we can muster. As the study of the human brain advanced, neuroscience began to raise some of the most profound and unsettling questions ever posed about free will. Unlike philosophy or psychology, which often rely on observation, reflection, and interpretation, neuroscience brought physical evidence to the discussion, using machines and measurements to peer into the activity of the living brain. One of the most influential and often discussed experiments in this area was conducted in the 1980s by the neuroscientist Benjamin Libet. In his study, Libet asked participants to perform a simple task: move their hand whenever they felt like it, and then report the moment they became aware of their intention to move. While the task seemed straightforward, the results were deeply surprising. Using EEG technology to measure electrical activity in the brain, Libet discovered that a specific type of brain signal, known as the readiness potential, appeared several hundred milliseconds before participants reported feeling the conscious urge to move. This suggested that the brain had already begun preparing for the action before the person became consciously aware of the decision. To many, this finding implied that what we experience as a free choice might actually be the result of unconscious processes. The mind appears to make the decision before we know it has done so, raising the troubling possibility that consciousness might not be the source of choice, but a late arrival, merely observing and rationalizing decisions already made. Libet's work sparked decades of debate and was followed by even more ambitious experiments. In 2008, a group of researchers led by Chunseong Soon expanded on Libet's work using more advanced brain imaging technology known as fMRI. Their study involved more complex decisions, such as choosing between pressing one of two buttons. What they found was even more astonishing. Patterns of brain activity in certain regions, including the prefrontal cortex, could predict with significant accuracy which button a participant would press up to 7 seconds before the person reported making a conscious choice. 7 seconds is a long time in the brain. This finding suggested that a measurable decision-making process had already begun well before people became aware of making any choice. These results fueled growing doubts about whether free will, as commonly understood, had any place in our scientific picture of the mind. If the brain is already leaning toward one option long before we consciously make a decision, then what role, if any, does our conscious self actually play? However, these experiments, though powerful, have not gone unchallenged. Many scholars have raised thoughtful and careful objections, pointing out that the tasks used in such studies are very narrow and artificial. Pressing a button with no consequences, choosing a direction to move one's finger, or selecting between meaningless options may not reflect the kinds of choices we care about when we speak of free will. Moral decisions, complex planning, and acts of deep reflection may involve a much broader and more integrated set of brain functions. Critics argue that while the brain might indeed make some minor choices automatically, this does not mean that all choices are automatic or unconscious. Furthermore, the awareness of intention might not be the sole marker of free will. Some suggest that conscious control can still play a role in shaping, approving, or canceling an unconscious impulse before it is acted upon. In fact, even Libet himself acknowledged the possibility that, while we may not initiate an action, we might still have the ability to veto it. He called this the power of free won't, the idea that the conscious mind might still stop an action before it is completed. This brings us to a deeper and more philosophical point. Perhaps the discoveries of neuroscience do not prove that free will is an illusion, but rather that it is more subtle and layered than we once believed. Instead of thinking of free will as the power to act in absolute independence from the brain, we might begin to see it as the ability of the conscious mind to participate in and influence a larger, ongoing process of decision-making. The self may not be the original author of every thought or impulse, but it may still play a meaningful role in shaping how those thoughts are interpreted and what actions are ultimately taken. In this view, free will is not dead, but it must be reimagined. It is no longer the sovereign ruler of the mind, commanding from a central throne, but rather a thoughtful observer and participant in a vast and complex inner world. It might not control the first spark, but it helps guide the flame. Neuroscience has forced us to abandon simple and comforting ideas about freedom, but it has also opened new doors, inviting us to understand ourselves with greater honesty, humility, and perhaps even wonder. In the modern age, as the long-standing debate over free will continued to unfold, philosophers began developing new ways of thinking that tried to respond to the growing challenges raised by science, psychology, and earlier philosophical reflection. The question was no longer simply whether free will exists or not, but how we should understand freedom in a world that seems shaped by countless causes, many of which lie beyond our control. Some thinkers sought to defend a place for free will by reimagining what it means, while others concluded that the entire concept might be nothing more than a comforting illusion. In this rich and complex conversation, three main positions have emerged, each offering a distinct way to interpret the nature of human choice and responsibility in a world governed by laws, patterns, and influences. One influential perspective is known as compatibilism. At its heart, compatibilism argues that free will and determinism are not enemies, but can actually work together. This view holds that a person can be free even if their desires and actions have causes that stretch back in time. What matters, according to compatibilists, is not whether a decision is ultimately caused by something outside of us, but whether the decision flows from our internal thoughts, feelings, and goals in a way that reflects who we are. Philosopher Daniel Dennett is one of the leading voices in this tradition. He argues that freedom should not be imagined as absolute independence from the past, but as the ability to act in accordance with our own reasons, without external force or coercion. In other words, if I choose to help a friend because I want to, and not because I was threatened or manipulated, then I am acting freely, even if my desire to help that friend was shaped by earlier experiences. Compatibilism asks us to let go of the unrealistic fantasy of total self-creation and instead accept a more nuanced view of freedom, one that fits within a world where causes and reasons still allow space for meaningful choice. In stark contrast to this hopeful view stands the position known as hard determinism. This perspective accepts all the scientific and philosophical evidence for determinism, but denies that any form of free will can survive in such a world. One of the most well-known contemporary defenders of this view is Sam Harris, a neuroscientist and philosopher who has written and spoken widely on the illusion of free will. Harris argues that every thought we have, every decision we make, is the result of causes we did not choose and cannot control. Our genetics, our upbringing, the experiences we have had, and even the structure of our brains, all of these shape who we are and what we do. From this point of view, the sense of being the conscious author of our actions is a mental trick, a kind of illusion that arises because we are unaware of the complex machinery that produces our choices. Harris suggests that while this idea may be unsettling, it can also lead to greater compassion. If people are not truly in control of their actions, then perhaps we should be less quick to judge and punish, and more willing to understand the deep causes behind behavior. Hard determinism, though it removes traditional notions of moral responsibility, encourages a different kind of ethical reflection grounded in empathy and systemic awareness. A third position, which continues to defend the existence of free will in a more traditional sense, is called libertarian free will. This view holds that some human actions are not determined by prior causes and that individuals can genuinely choose among different possibilities. Philosopher Robert Caine has been a key voice in defending this idea, although he acknowledges that true free will is rare and not easy to define. For Caine, real freedom involves a special kind of decision-making that he calls self-forming actions. These are moments in life when a person faces deep inner conflict and must choose between competing values or desires, often without clear guidance. In such moments, the individual is not merely following a chain of cause and effect, but is instead contributing to the shaping of their own identity. Caine believes that it is in these hard, uncertain choices that we find the clearest expressions of human freedom. However, he also admits that these moments are difficult to identify and may not occur frequently in every life. Libertarian free will, then, is not the everyday experience of choosing what to eat or where to go, but a deeper and more demanding form of personal authorship that emerges in morally significant or transformative situations. These three modern views, compatibilism, hard determinism, and libertarianism, do not simply offer answers, but invite us to reflect more deeply on what we really mean by freedom. Is it enough to act according to our desires, even if those desires were shaped by forces we did not choose? Must we be able to stand outside the chain of causality altogether to be truly free? Or is freedom a rare and precious act of creation that only arises in moments of deep struggle and self-reflection? In the end, the modern philosophical landscape shows us that the question of free will has not been resolved, but has instead evolved. It remains one of the most intimate and difficult questions we can ask, not only about the nature of human action, but about what it means to be a person living in a world that is both beautiful and bound by order. As the debate over free will moved from philosophy and science into the realm of everyday life, its implications became not only intellectual, but deeply practical and moral. If free will does not exist in the way people have traditionally believed, then society must rethink some of its most important systems and values, especially those connected to justice, responsibility, and human dignity. Perhaps nowhere is this tension felt more sharply than in the field of criminal justice. The legal system is built on the idea that individuals are responsible for their actions and can be held accountable when they choose to break the law. Punishment, whether it comes in the form of imprisonment, fines, or rehabilitation, is justified on the assumption that people acted freely and could have chosen otherwise. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if people commit crimes not because they freely chose evil, but because of a complex mix of brain chemistry, childhood trauma, environmental pressure, or mental illness? This is the dilemma raised by neuroscience, psychology, and modern philosophy. If a person's actions were determined by factors beyond their control, can we truly say they deserve punishment? Or should our focus shift toward understanding, prevention, and treatment? This question becomes even more urgent when we consider the problem of addiction. An addict often engages in behavior that causes harm not only to themselves but also to others. From theft and violence to neglect and broken relationships, the consequences of addiction can be severe. But addiction also involves powerful biological and psychological forces that make self-control extraordinarily difficult. The brain of an addict may respond to certain substances in ways that override normal decision-making processes. Cravings, triggers, and withdrawal symptoms can hijack the person's ability to reflect and choose. Some researchers argue that addiction is a chronic brain disease, not a failure of willpower. If this is true, then holding addicts fully responsible for their actions may be both unfair and ineffective. Yet others point out that not all addicts behave the same way, and many recover through effort and support, suggesting that some degree of personal responsibility still matters. The challenge is to understand how much of an addict's behavior is shaped by biology and how much can be influenced by personal effort and choice. This balance remains one of the most ethically sensitive and scientifically debated topics in discussions about free will. Mental health more broadly raises similar questions. Take, for example, the experience of severe depression. A person suffering from depression may withdraw from loved ones, fail to meet responsibilities, or even harm themselves. From the outside, these actions can appear selfish, lazy, or irrational, but depression often involves profound changes in how the brain processes emotion, motivation, and judgment. Choices that seem simple or obvious to others may feel impossible to someone who is deeply depressed. The ability to choose joy, hope, or even basic action can be painfully limited. In such cases, the question arises again. Can we hold someone fully responsible for what they do while in the grip of a mental illness that distorts perception and will? On the other hand, not all people with depression behave in the same way, and many actively seek help and support. This variation complicates any simple judgment. What mental health forces us to confront is the possibility that freedom is not all or nothing but exists on a spectrum. Some people may have more freedom in certain moments than others, and recognizing this may lead to a more compassionate and realistic understanding of human behavior. Real-life court cases have begun to reflect these deep uncertainties. There have been instances where defense lawyers have argued that their clients should not be held criminally responsible because their brains were wired in ways that made certain behaviors almost inevitable. One well-known example involves a man who committed violent acts and was later found to have a brain tumor pressing on parts of the brain involved in impulse control. After the tumor was removed, his behavior dramatically changed. This case raised disturbing questions. Was he guilty, or was he a victim of his own biology? In other cases, lawyers have cited childhood abuse, neurological disorders, or genetic predispositions as reasons for reduced responsibility. These arguments are not always successful, and they remain controversial. Critics worry that such defenses could erode the entire basis of legal responsibility. If no one is ever fully responsible, how can society protect itself or provide justice for victims? Yet, supporters argue that understanding the true causes of behavior can lead to better solutions, ones that prevent harm rather than simply punish it after the fact. What all these examples show is that the question of free will is not only a topic for scholars and scientists, it is a living issue that affects how we treat each other, how we understand suffering, and how we build institutions meant to uphold justice and care. Whether we are dealing with a person facing trial, someone struggling with addiction, or a loved one battling mental illness, we are forced to ask, how free was this person in that moment? What might have helped them make a different choice, if any choice was even possible? In these questions, we find not easy answers, but a call to deeper understanding. The debate over free will, when applied to real life, asks us not only to judge, but to listen, to look beneath the surface, and to recognize that human freedom, whatever it is, may be as fragile as it is precious. As the journey through science, philosophy, psychology, and law slowly draws us into deeper waters, we arrive at one of the most intimate and difficult questions of all. If free will does not exist, does life lose its meaning? This question does not belong only to scholars or scientists. It belongs to every person who has ever wondered whether their life truly matters, whether their efforts and struggles are their own, or whether they are simply playing out a role written by forces they cannot see or change. When people reflect on the possibility that free will might be an illusion, it can evoke a deep sense of unease. Many of the values we hold most dear, such as moral responsibility, personal growth, and dignity, seem to rest on the assumption that we are, at least in some meaningful way, the authors of our actions. Without free will, can we still take credit for love, courage, kindness, or creativity? Can we still be blamed for cruelty, betrayal, or neglect? These are not just intellectual puzzles. They touch on the very foundations of how we live and how we understand ourselves. One powerful response to this dilemma comes from the tradition of existentialism, which arose in the 20th century in response to the growing realization that meaning cannot be simply inherited from religion, tradition, or even science. Among the most influential existentialist thinkers was Jean-Paul Sartre, who famously argued that freedom is not only real, but inescapable. According to Sartre, human beings are condemned to be free. What he meant by this is that no matter how much we might try to hide behind excuses or systems or circumstances, we are always making choices, even when we choose not to choose. For Sartre, there is no fixed human nature or divine plan that tells us who we are or what we must do. We create ourselves through our actions, and in doing so, we bear the full weight of responsibility for what we become. This kind of freedom is not comforting. It is heavy, often painful, because it means there is no one else to blame. But it also opens the door to a life of authenticity. In a world without predetermined meaning, we are the ones who must create meaning, not through empty words, but through living deliberately and courageously. For Sartre, this is not a loss, but a profound opportunity, though one that demands honesty, commitment, and often a painful clarity. A very different but equally deep perspective comes from the philosophical teachings of Buddhism. Rather than focusing on individual choice or responsibility, Buddhist thought invites us to let go of the very idea of the self as a fixed and controlling center. According to Buddhist teachings, suffering arises when we cling to illusions, especially the illusion of a separate, permanent self who is in control of life. From this view, the desire for total freedom or absolute self-mastery is itself a source of suffering because it traps us in a constant struggle against the changing, interconnected nature of reality. Instead of insisting on free will or lamenting its possible absence, Buddhism suggests that peace and meaning come from accepting the truth of impermanence, interdependence, and the fluid nature of being. By letting go of the need to control everything, including ourselves, we can begin to experience a different kind of freedom, not the freedom to choose anything at any time, but the freedom that comes from wisdom, compassion, and inner clarity. In this view, meaning is not something we impose on the world, but something that arises naturally when we learn to live with mindfulness, presence, and compassion toward all beings. Together, these traditions reveal that even if traditional notions of free will are weakened or discarded, life does not become meaningless. Rather, it challenges us to find or create meaning in new ways. Whether we accept the existentialist view that we must invent our values through free and conscious action, or the Buddhist view that we must transcend the illusion of control to find inner peace, both paths lead to a profound engagement with life as it truly is. They remind us that meaning is not something given but something lived. If free will as once imagined no longer holds, this does not leave us empty. It calls us to a more mature understanding of human life, one that sees value not in perfect control, but in how we respond to our condition, how we care for others, and how we make sense of our place in a world that is at once uncertain and full of possibility. As we look to the future, the question of free will does not fade but becomes more urgent and more complex. New technologies, especially in the fields of artificial intelligence and neuroscience, are pushing us into territory where traditional ideas about freedom, agency, and responsibility may no longer be enough. One of the most fascinating and unsettling developments is the rise of artificial intelligence. Machines that can learn, adapt, and even generate creative responses are now part of our everyday lives, from virtual assistants that respond to our voices to complex systems that make medical or financial decisions. This raises a question that was once purely theoretical. Can machines ever have free will? On the surface, the answer seems to be no. Since every algorithm is written by a human being and runs on predictable rules, even if those rules become extremely complex. But as machines begin to mimic human behavior more closely, including language, emotion, and decision-making, it becomes harder to draw a clear line between programmed response and genuine choice. Some thinkers argue that if a machine could reflect on its actions, revise its goals, and operate independently from direct human control, then it might exhibit a kind of artificial agency. Others insist that without consciousness, self-awareness, and moral understanding, such behavior can never truly count as free. This debate is not only technical, but philosophical, because it forces us to ask what freedom really means and whether it depends on biology, intention, or something else entirely. At the same time, developments in brain-computer interfaces are beginning to blur the boundaries between mind and machine in even more personal ways. These technologies, which allow the brain to communicate directly with computers, are being developed to help people with disabilities control prosthetic limbs, speak through thought alone, or interact with virtual environments without physical movement. While these breakthroughs offer incredible hope and new freedom for many people, they also open profound questions about identity and autonomy. What happens if technology not only reads our thoughts, but starts to influence them? If a device can enhance memory, suppress pain, or encourage specific moods or actions, how much of our behavior is still truly ours? What if the line between assistance and control becomes unclear? These questions are no longer science fiction. As technology begins to reach deeper into the human nervous system, it becomes possible that choices once made freely by the mind could be shaped or even directed by software. This could create new forms of dependency, manipulation, or loss of self that we do not yet fully understand. The challenge will be to ensure that these tools remain in service of human freedom rather than subtly replacing it. All of this brings us to a set of ethical dilemmas that are as urgent as they are difficult. If our actions are increasingly understood as the product of brain states, environmental inputs, or even technological guidance, should we still talk about moral praise and blame in the same way? Should we continue to reward success as if it were entirely earned, or punish failure as if it were purely a personal fault? The legal system, education, employment, and even personal relationships are built on assumptions about personal responsibility. But as we learn more about the influences that shape behavior and the limits of conscious control, these assumptions become harder to defend. Some ethicists suggest that we may need to shift our focus away from blame and toward understanding, rehabilitation, and care. Others warn that too much softness could lead to moral confusion or lack of accountability. The future of the free will debate is not just about abstract theory. It is about how we treat each other, how we design our institutions, and how we navigate the risks and promises of new technologies. In a world where freedom is increasingly hard to define, the task ahead is not only to protect what remains of it, but to ask what kind of freedom we want to preserve, and for what kind of future we are preparing ourselves for. After walking through the vast and intricate landscape of the free will debate, a quiet and powerful realization begins to take shape. Perhaps the true meaning of life does not depend entirely on whether or not we are free in the way we once imagined. Instead, it may rest in how we respond to the limits that shape us. We are born into a world we did not choose, with bodies we did not design, in cultures we did not create, shaped by genes, histories, and environments far beyond our control. If all of this is true or even partially true, then our freedom is not absolute. It is touched, guided, and sometimes constrained by many forces. But within that space, however small it may be, there remains a human capacity to reflect, to care, to resist, to question, to love, and to grow. That capacity is not meaningless just because it is not unlimited. In fact, the presence of limits may make our choices more meaningful, not less, because they ask us to respond with courage and creativity in the face of difficulty. When a person chooses kindness despite hardship, honesty despite temptation, or hope despite despair, they are not acting as uncaused gods of their own destiny. They are acting as human beings, aware of their limitations but still striving towards something good. This striving itself may be the heart of meaning. If we accept that free will is real but limited, shaped but not destroyed by causes, then we must also rethink how we build our societies. Justice systems that rest entirely on punishment and blame may no longer seem fair if behavior is more deeply influenced by factors like trauma, inequality, mental illness, or neural patterns. Education systems that reward only outcomes may overlook the uneven starting lines from which children begin. Even relationships can become more compassionate when we understand that people do not always choose who they are in simple or direct ways. This does not mean giving up on responsibility or moral guidance. It means creating systems that encourage growth, healing, and reflection rather than simply punishing failure or rewarding surface success. A society built with this understanding might be more gentle and more just. It might seek not only to correct wrongs, but to ask why they happened and how they might be prevented in the future. This shift does not erase accountability, but grounds it in empathy and knowledge, recognizing that while no one is perfectly free, everyone has the potential to act meaningfully within their constraints. And so, even if free will is smaller than we once believed, even if it is a delicate flame flickering inside the winds of causality, human beings still matter. We matter not because we are the sole authors of our lives, but because we are participants in the unfolding of a world that is unfinished and open to influence. Our thoughts, actions, and values still shape the lives of others. Our kindness is still comforting. Our cruelty still wounds. Our choices, even when imperfect or partial, still ripple outward in ways we may never fully see. This does not diminish the human story, it deepens it. The beauty of life may lie not in being perfectly free, but in living wisely and compassionately within the tangled, beautiful, and often mysterious conditions of our existence. In the end, what matters most may not be whether we are entirely free, but whether we use the freedom we do have to become better versions of ourselves, to lift others when we can, and to keep asking questions even when the answers are uncertain. This perhaps is where meaning begins,